Let us briefly touch upon a fundamental part of what it means to be human, of the human condition. And I will use a term coined or attributed to Socrates of Athens. And the term is know thyself. Now this term might sound simple or too philosophical for us to contemplate, but I think it goes to the core of what identity is and what we're talking about when we're talking about accepting the past, knowing who we are. To know yourself is to know as much of who you are and what determined you. In other words, it is a connection with your past, even the past that preceded your birth. In fact, the more of this that you know, the more of a sense of self that you have. When we become self-conscious, this means that we become conscious of self. That is, a part of the brain develops the capacity, the ability to observe itself thinking. Just as consciousness is a part of the universe, evolving the capacity to observe itself acting, since existence is action, self-consciousness, which is a later development, a sophistication of consciousness, is the separation of a portion of consciousness so as to observe itself in the act, because thinking is also an act of thinking. Now this, if it goes wrong, could also develop schizophrenia. That is, the notion that there's somebody else pulling the strings, or there's somebody else occupying our skull. In the religious area, the psychopathy of monistic religion, this evolves into the notion that there's something outside of our brain making us think, or talking to us within our skull. When man developed self-consciousness, he developed the possibility of knowing himself more than any creature could. And to know yourself means to know, like I said before, as much of your past, even the one that preceded your birth, as possible. And also to accept it, because it takes courage to accept what we see. And the past doesn't mean because it's us that it's flattering, or that it's easy to take. Sometimes it takes courage, it takes strength to accept who and what we are. Because to know yourself is to know your strengths, which is easy, sometimes so easy that we exaggerate our strengths, but more so is the ability to accurately, without exaggeration, perceive our weaknesses. Because if we exaggerate our weaknesses, just as when we exaggerate our strengths, we don't have a clear conception of who and what we are. In the one case, it leads to arrogance and this self-righteousness, this sense of indestructibility, whereas in the other, it might lead to depression, self-hatred, world denouncement. Right away we realize that to know yourself, to know thyself, is not so easy. It's not as easy as it first appeared. Because to know yourself is to accept the parts of yourself which are not positive, which are restricting, which are determining, which cannot be overcome. To accept them as being a necessary part of who you are. Self-love is not about exceeding your limits all the time. Sometimes it's about accepting your limits, accepting their judgment, their unbending challenge. the area of sexual encounters, sexual identifications, to know yourself means to know what your sex is, why it evolved, what characteristics it imposes upon you, forcing you to deal with it. Limitations which cannot be dismissed, or they can be dismissed, but they can't be overcome. They can be ignored, but they cannot be surpassed. No matter how much a woman would say that she's much more than just being a woman, the moment she identifies with her sexuality, or even if she doesn't, her sexuality imposes its determining factors upon her, no matter how feminine or masculine she might be. And the same goes with men. In the area of culture, to know yourself is to know your heritage, your inheritance, your bloodline, to know where you came from, to know what environment your people evolved in, what forces shaped them, what ideas came from them, what struggles challenged them. Of course, the conduit to our past is our parents. And it used to be that our culture provided an indication of where we came from, but this is no longer the case. In modern systems, because they seek to integrate heterogeneous populations, the family, as I've noted in another video, becomes detrimental to social cohesion. That means it has to be eradicated. Now this serves two purposes. First, it takes away a resistant element, a disruptive element. That is a male's little kingdom, because family was a man's kingdom. In this way, enhancing the potential for uniformity. But its most important role is that by eliminating this connection to the past, it leaves the mind helpless to the present. It leaves it like a boat in the sea, in the stormy sea, without an anchor, without sails. When a mind is ripped from its past, its identity is slandered, it's diminished, it's eradicated. When it is taught that it's born anew every time, that with its birth nothing of the past came with it, then it leaves it, like I said, helpless before a system that can then impose upon it its ideals, its identifications, its value systems. So the brain, evolving in a culture where it has no connection, no inheritance, no heritage, where it's told that to think in those terms is primal and primitive, where the family has been destroyed, where the tabula rasa is preached as a modernistic holy scripture coming from Locke, that absurdity that when a child is born, it is not determined by anything from the past, at least not mentally, because not even the most fanatical liberal or Christian could say that physically nothing is inherited, but mentally, that there they draw the line, there they make a distinction that although they inherit traits from the parents and and they can see the connection to a past, an inheritance, a genetic inheritance, they refuse to accept that this applies to the mind, to mental potentials, to mental capabilities. In this way, they make the mind, like I said, vulnerable to the system, because once the child is left in the void, it grasps for anything that would identify it, that would give it a anchoring, that would give it a value. And the system steps in, having eradicated the family, like I said, having diminished the role of the father, and offers it its values. In the West, in modern times, this has been money, wealth, social class, social status. Then the child becomes a willing servant, a willing slave. It doesn't question the system because it's the only source of identification it has. by destroying the system, it feels like it's leaving itself again in the void, without any purpose, without any meaning, without any identity. Now we can even understand why relationships and people have become so superficial, so bland, so dull, so shallow. People have nothing to draw on, no depth. So the simpleton remains simple, whereas in the past he would have drawn from a tradition. A tradition maybe he wouldn't have fully understood, but still, a tradition that would have given him a direction, a meaning, a purpose, an identification. Today he is given recyclable material, throwaway identities. He wears a uniform and he thinks that is him. He goes to a job and he thinks his job is him. He buys a car and he thinks the car is an extension of himself, because he has no roots. He's like a tree with shallow roots, a tree growing on a rock. With the slightest breeze, he topples over. He's vulnerable to any slight motion. That means that he has no ability to resist, so he's easily manipulated. This elimination of the past now becomes beneficial to the system. It wants nothing of the past to remain. It wants the individual to think, to believe that it is free from the past, even though the past cannot be simply dismissed in this way. You can deny your past, but it's still there. You can deny the determining aspects of the past, but that doesn't mean you've overcome them, or that they don't still affect your present. The system simply wants to promote this idea of freedom, what it calls freedom, to an individual who desperately wants to escape the determining parts of the past which he doesn't like, he or she doesn't like. So he can choose, or she can choose, to accept certain things of the past, the ones that he feels that are flattering, or things that are not too harsh, whereas other parts he refuses to take, and the system gives him the ability to dismiss the past as if it did not matter, as if he were born out of some void, as if species does not matter, doesn't play any part, as if intelligence doesn't evolve like any other trait that sort of springs out of some magical realm and has no connection to genetics. By doing so, the system, a globalized system, eradicates all competition, all mimetic competition, in effect making the individual its servant. And of course the individual gulps it up, is prone towards it, it is seduced by it, because it so desperately wants the past to be irrelevant, because there's a sense of self-hatred here, an inability to accept oneself. And like I said, self is some of the past. Therefore, accepting the past is accepting oneself. Dismissing the past is dismissing oneself. This is where the idea, or the ideal, or the myth of free will comes from. Also the myth of individuality. And you will see that it's most popular amongst the people that have the least individuality of all. It is the most simple, the most base, who are the ones that claim that to be the most individualistic. It's because this individuality is built upon, like I said, this eradication, this slandering, this dismissal of the past. The individual is told something that it wants to believe, that is that the past has no effect upon his present. It does not limit him, doesn't inhibit him in any way. He gulps it up, of course. And in so doing, his identity is built upon superficiality, that is, the most immediate. This is where he turns hedonistic and materialistic, because he needs to grab onto anything solid, any sensation, any material grounding to feel like he exists. This disconnection of the individual from its past, from alternative sources of self-awareness, of connecting with its past, its inheritance, its heritage, you not only create shallow, superficial individuals, easily manipulated, but also you might convince them that they're free, when in fact they are slaves. Free because they can choose between name brands, because they can go vacation, or because they can vote once every 4 years for in between 2 choices and 3 choices. By convincing that the slave that he is already free, what you're doing is you're making sure that he will never rebel. And since his only source of identification is his servitude, is his status gained through servitude, through servicing, through adhering to the social norms, through climbing the social ladder, he will not, as he gets older, destroy this investment. This is why we see that individuals, as they get older, they become more and more conservative, whereas when they're younger, they might be more likely to rebel against social norms. This is because as an individual grows older and his investments in the system, in time and in effort, accumulate, then he's less likely to ignore this investment, destroy it, because in essence he would be admitting that it was all for nothing, that he was duped, that he was tricked.